From Wana Brands, welcome to Enhance Your Life. I'm your host, Jonathan Small, and each week I talk to people from all sorts of professions and backgrounds about how cannabis has enhanced their lives and how this healing plant can enrich your life too. Hey everybody, welcome to the Enhance Your Life podcast. My name is John Small and I'm your host, and I am thrilled to bring you two guests today who have a fantastic podcast called the Cannabis School podcast. My guests are Brandon Elder and Jesse Angelus, and they are the hosts of said Cannabis School podcast. And they describe this show as a chilled out, entertaining, and an educational show which promotes responsible conversations about personal consumption. And it's very much like our show. They share the benefits of using cannabis in your life. They go even deeper. They talk a lot about strains, which I'm always fascinated to find out about, and talk a lot about the medical side, as well as the recreational side of cannabis, and how this plant has changed the lives of so many people who have come in contact with it. Brandon and Jesse, welcome to the show.
Hey, brother. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us on.
So love to hear the origin story of this Cannabis School podcast program. How did you guys come up with this idea?
Well, Brandon's got to, you've got to go into that story. Do you tell him? It's 2 o'clock.
Yeah, you're starting to tell me the story before I roll tape. And I'm like, wait, hold on. You got to tell the story while we're recording. Okay, so origin story of the Cannabis School podcast. Go.
Yeah, so many moons ago, I was on a psilocybin trip.
Just a random one.
Yeah, well, it was actually contemplating the many universal theories and things in my life at that time. So about 2 o'clock in the morning, I give Jesse a call and I'm like, hey man, just want you to know, we need to create a podcast. We're going to change the world. We're going to talk about cannabis.
Is this why you were still tripping a little bit?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. In the middle of it.
Yeah.
Called him up in the middle because this is my best friend. We talk about everything. So yeah. And about 2 years later, it was about several months of discussion, design, creation, and then it's been about almost a year that we've been out.
Yeah, just under a year. And prior to that, even though we'd had this discussion at 2 a.m., I'm like, all right, bro. Yeah, sounds great. Cool. Well,
right.
Talk to you later. We'll get together and we'll sesh. But it just kind of stayed in the back of both of our minds. And I actually started working with a podcast production company, and working with them. I learned a little bit from that one, but I started to learn about the structure of it. And I'm a storyteller, and that's what I do a lot within, the, I don't know, you could say professional world. It's a passion of mine. I'm in that world. And we were just trying to figure out, it took months for us to be able to come up with the concept, because we didn't just want to put out another podcast about here's how you grow it, here's how you make money from it, and that one time I was high. There's too many of those, right? And it's cool, like listening to Mike Tyson in hotboxing. I mean, hotboxing with Mike Tyson, those are fascinating, hilarious stories. They're great.
Yeah.
But Mike Tyson can pull that off.
Right. It's a very different thing when you don't have a Mike Tyson or a Seth Rogen or whatever, whoever you think you're going to get. Yeah.
Right.
Or some edible ear gummies that you have behind you.
Those are dope, by the way. Those are
hard to compete with.
Have you guys tried? Have you guys tried an edible ear gummy yet?
No,
I haven't either.
Have you?
No.
Oh man,
very, very curious. All right, so you came up with this idea basically while tripping, kind of like the way like Steve Jobs has talked about, coming up with ideas for the iPad, right, while he was at Burning Man. So that's exciting. So what was the concept? Like, how do you describe your show?
We remove the fear, questions, and stigmas around cannabis.
Yeah, and being able to come from the perspective of the new consumer, the consumer that's on the fence. Our target audience typically is around mid 20s into the late 40s and beyond that. But it's a strong, the feedback that we get from people is like, wow, this is so easy. It's actually having a conversation about cannabis in a very, very easy to understand way. It's not like some people you meet in the cannabis world. I mean, they're getting down like into the chemical breakdown. You're like, oh, bro, it's got all of these terpenes and here's the cannabinoids. And
those are the
matter of fact,
people.
I've got it on my phone. Let me show you.
Yeah.
You lose me in the weeds,
so to speak.
Right. And it's just being on a simplistic level with the consumer going, hey, look, I mean, Brandon's the one that brought me into the cannabis world, Before that, there was just pot and bad pot. And, I mean, we got a large generation gap between both of us. But at the same time, like we were just thinking, like, what's more important? Is it that people understand that each one of these strains will have slightly different effects on your body, but what it'll do to be able to make your life better? And it's only done that for me. And I mean, Brandon is just the nicest guy in the world. He helped me literally through cannabis. Yeah, but he's more loving, and we're from Utah, and predominantly Christian religion with the Latter-day Saints. But even then, I'm like, hey, you want to be a little bit more like Jesus? Take a couple hits off of this, and you'll love everybody around you. And
there is a cannabis church. I talked to the guy recently that runs that. Well, that is interesting that you're in Utah. Is cannabis even legal in Utah recreationally?
Medically.
No, only medically. Okay.
Medically. Mm-hmm. 2020 passed.
That's terrific.
They passed the initial and then changed the law of what everyone put into through ballot initiative. And now we have what remains, and I think it's the HB 102.
Yeah.
So people think of Utah. I'm watching Banner Under the Stars, whatever it's called right now. The Mormon murder
My brother
mystery.
told me about that.
Yeah. And I think people think of Utah. Obviously, if you've never spent a lot of time in Utah, you think of it, as you mentioned, very Christian, very Mormon. How is cannabis received in that state? Like, what's your take on the way people think about it?
It's been a lot of education, and I think that's the basis of why we came up with this podcast. Was I've been in cannabis for many years. I have a cracked disc, and it's helped me manage pain. And that was my initial reason for getting into it. And then past that, I've realized my mental health is better, my productivity, my focus. Like, I use cannabis for a million different things, but because it actually benefits me for those things. And I was having conversations with family members, friends, and just genuinely educating people. And so that's where this came about, was like, hey, we're already having these conversations with people. We're educating and talking about that. We should do that on a larger scale, because there's people everywhere who have these same questions. They're curious about cannabis, but they're skeptical. They're on the fence, but they're like, I don't know if it's for me. And if we can go in and go, hey, this is really all it is. Let's help you understand what this plant is and what it isn't. And that has been able to open the eyes and the doors for so many people, just going, yeah, okay, I'll try it. I'll go low and slow, and I'll try it. I'll look at specific strains or terpenes, cannabinoids. Maybe I'll look at something that's 3-to-1, something that just benefits me specifically.
Right.
And on even when you're talking about, like, it's such a strong religious affiliation, it's a predominant religion here is the LDS Church. And I'm a member of the LDS Church, and I use cannabis. And that's the thing. I'm super open about it. Would you say I'm the straight and narrow guy? Probably not. I mean, I'm tatted up, and I consume cannabis. But actually, like, within a lot of the LDS communities, and because I'm so open about it, I'm a speaker, I'm a marketer, I'm constantly engaged with the community. Most of the time, it's this weird whisper moment. They're like, hey, where do you get it? Like, what do you think it could help with this thing in my life, with my pain and or in anxiety, or I've got my wife, she's depressed a lot, or there's so many different stories, and they're so afraid of it. And I think the best part that the state making it legal was the best step going forward. But to what Brandon had just said, and piggybacking off of that, the funniest side effect from our podcast, and I'll call it a side effect, is that a lot of dispensaries across the U.S. use our podcast to train their bud tenders or to help educate their consumers.
That's amazing.
And it's so cool. We've loved that part.
How did you guys become experts, like, enough to be able to have your own podcast? I mean, what is I guess people might ask, what is your background? How do you know so much about cannabis?
So mostly self-taught.
Right.
We got into it. Again, and Brandon can get deep in the paint when it comes to, like, everything cannabis, because it's so passionate. And we actually, one of the biggest things for us, why this came from it, was a very unfortunate thing that does happen within the cannabis world, and that's investing. Mm-hmm. And Brandon had invested into a grow, and he was talking to me saying, hey man, I don't think they understand a lot about business. Could you talk to them? And then I became a quasi CEO of this grow out in Oklahoma. And I started to uncover a lot of it, and it turned out to be wire fraud.
Oh, wow. Scary.
But he started learning more about the chemical breakdowns. What's required for the grow? You can't just toss this out like Johnny Appleseed and say, I'll be back in, 9 weeks and we'll just have great cannabis. Like, there's so much more that goes into it. Like, when people are like, oh, do you go to Trader Joe's? Like, they need to be looking at dispensaries like Trader Joe's. They need to be connoisseurs. They need to know what are the good things that I want in my body, not just some random garbage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So really, it's been like a decade of education and learning because, like most people, I socially smoked after high school with friends, like every once in a while. And then when my oldest daughter was born, I threw away all my stuff because it was illegal. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to risk anything. And I didn't touch it again till years and years and years later when a friend came by and I had already cracked my disc in my back and I was heavily drinking because that's smart and what people do. So he came over and was like, oh, do you mind if I, smoke a joint out back? And I'm like, no, I don't care. I'm just not going to smoke it with you. And so we started talking about it and he asked, well, why? Do you mind me asking? And I'm like, oh, explain my stance on it at the time. Granted, I had about as much education on it, I feel, as most politicians or people who have a stance on it.
Right.
He was like, the first thing that he said that really stood out to me was, well, you know that this plant that you think is a drug, actually the government holds the medical patent for. And that just kind of blew my mind because I'm like, wait, but it's Schedule 1, which claims there are 0 medical benefits. So
Right.
how can you claim that and at the same time
those things
hold a
don't square.
patent
Yeah.
for its medical benefits? And so from that moment on, I just started researching and reading test results, reading data, reading the research that US paid Israel to do since 1998. Like, there's tons of research and data and information out there. And then investing into a grow. I read Ed Rosenthal's Grower's Handbook, the Amsterdam University thing. I got that first thing and I read it like a normal book from page, like cover to cover, because I wanted to understand everything that I didn't at that point, because I'd already become a research whore and read everything I could find. And I still do, because I'm constantly curious what other information is coming out.
Do things still surprise you? Like, you guys have been learning about this plant now for a long time. You talk about it on your podcast. Even in your research over the last 10, 15 years, whatever, what has surprised you about cannabis? I mean, what you just mentioned, something that surprised me, and I don't think about it that way, that, the government having a patent on it, but also obviously it's a Schedule 1, that's weird contradiction. But but what surprises you about the plant, or what do you hear in your listeners when you talk to them about things that they find out about the plant?
I would say that it's the misconception every single time learning about these individuals who start using cannabis. We get emails coming through going, I was so apprehensive of trying cannabis due to the negative nature that it's been perceived as within media or anything. I mean, going back as far as to the Reefer Madness short films that they created, right? A lot of propaganda. And it's interesting because it's not really seen. I mean, you got dispensaries everywhere, right? In Utah, when it was legalized, it came out a little bit. Now they're like going crazy, but it's a good thing because it's starting to be able to help with the legislation. That's what we find so interesting, is that I would say this is by far the most interesting thing. It's not necessarily the new consumers. It's people who've been using cannabis for years and they go, I didn't know there were different strains. I just get whatever they tell me to. Like, I go in and
cannabis.
Yeah, I just smoke this, just eat this, right? And that to me it's almost like people running around not really appreciating the value of the plant. They only think of like, I only need it for one thing and that's it. And I only use it at this
one
time.
Kind of thing. Yeah. It only affects you in one way. So that's really interesting. So let's talk about that, because I would assume that maybe some people listening to this don't really know a lot about strains and even what you mean. And I've even heard people say they don't like the word strain because that's like what you call a virus, right? Or what is a strain? Like in your, definition, what is a strain, and what are we talking about when we're talking about strains?
It's like a specific breeding, like genetics of a seed, but a lot of the time that doesn't come out the same on the end product because the soil, the location, like the environmental effects, the like everything they're putting into it, the amount of like CO2 that comes into it. Like a lot of people don't consider, hey, are my light CO2 and oxygen levels and water levels, are they all equal? Even that point, you have maybe an excess of one, and having that excess of one actually harms the other. So it's better to have things like there's so much that strains are great, but they kind of don't mean anything because people's terpene profiles, their cannabinoids that are actually created are from like the lights, everything that goes into the grow. So you might get one out of like California that is, let's say, blueberry headband. And it feels like blueberry headband. And then let's say you go out to Denver and you get another blueberry headband and it doesn't feel anything like
the one you had in California. Yeah.
Could be the exact same seed, could come from the exact same genetic line, but the way it was grown, the way it was like all the nutrients that were fed or not fed into it through this whole process really craft what comes out at the end. So strains are great, I think, in certain aspects. If you go to a dispensary and you're like, hey, I know these strains usually have these types of effects, these types of terpenes, these types of cannabinoid breakdowns. So if you have something similar to that, I would like to look at that because I know those work really well with my endocannabinoid system. And I know that these other terpenes or cannabinoids really don't work as well. I'm more anxious, I'm lethargic, I can't function, or it doesn't give the experience that they're looking for.
Right. Well, and from a marketing side, that's what I'm always thinking of. What's the consumer want? And that goes into our show. And the reason why I understand that some people go, I don't like the idea of strains. There's no real such thing as strains. But you know what people really love? They love variety. And it's like Baskin Robbins, pretty much. When you go in, there's different flavors, there's different things that you can expect out of that experience. If you have bubblegum ice cream, you're going to have two experiences. Hey, this tastes kind of good. And then this is really weird. This is like dry, weird pieces of gum in this, but it's the concept that really pulls you to it. It's the idea. So when I think of strains, I think of I like to be able to differentiate a lot, especially in a world that is very wanting everybody to be all inclusive. This is an opportunity for you to have a little bit more of a personal focus on what you're getting out of it. I mean, what if you went to Wendy's and you go and how you guys cook the burger, if you could cook it about this much longer or this less time, that would bring my experience up. You get the same thing if you go to a Wendy's every single time, no matter where you are, either LA or New York, right? But when you go to dispensaries, like Brandon was saying, you may get a different experience with a strain that you're understanding, like, hey, I've had it in Denver and it was like this, but in LA, it was
different,
completely different experience. So it should only be seen as geographical. Like, where am I at? Where's my climate? Okay.
Also, black market plays a factor. You have no clue what you're getting.
Right. So what do you do as a consumer? Like, if you know that you like, say, Blue Widow or, one of these strains, gelato, what do you do if you like it in California, but now you're in Oklahoma or in Utah even? How do you know how to find the right cannabis for you?
I would, and I'll only start it out, I would advise on look at the terpene profiles, really understanding the terpenes are going to be able to have more of an effect on that. So when you're talking to a bud tender, saying, hey, do you know the terpenes that are in this one? I mean, I know typically it'll be on a box or in a jar or whatever, but that's a good place where a lot of people need to feel more comfortable than anywhere is in dispensaries. They need to feel like they're talking to an expert because quite often, most of the people who've been consuming for years still don't know why.
Yeah, don't know what's in it. Yeah.
Which is surprising.
Yeah, I know. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, they'll go, it works. I don't know. It is surprising that, although you think, maybe somebody's drink Budweiser their whole life, but they don't really know what's in Bud. They just kind of like the way it tastes and the way it makes them feel. I don't know why, because Budweiser is pretty bad beer. This podcast brought to you by Budweiser. I mean, and it's interesting, this is, I feel like, a little bit of a difference between medical and recreational markets. And I don't know if you guys have ever, I'm sure you've been to a recreational dispensary in your life, right?
Oh, yeah.
So you walk into a recreational dispensary and you start asking about terpene profiles, and sometimes they'll look at you like you're nuts. Like, because most people who walk into dispensaries, they're not really looking a lot for medical cannabis, right? They're looking for cannabis that just gets them really high. This is my theory, because if I go in LA, and I just did this recently, I'm working on a book right now about anxiety, and I was kind of going around to different cannabis shops and asking them what they would recommend for anxiety. And a lot of kind of threw off some of the bud tenders, because they're used to the question of what has the most THC, And then when I started asking about terpene profiles, a lot of them were a little confused, or they didn't know, or even if they did know what the terpene profiles were, they weren't entirely sure what was the best for anxiety. So it's interesting that, I feel like in the medical market, which, because it's more medically focused, there might be more of a focus on terpenes, and there might be a little more knowledge about terpenes. But sometimes in the recreational market, where the demand is really about just getting really high for as little money as you can spend, there seems to be a little bit less of an emphasis on that. So it is important, whether you're shopping recreationally or medically, to understand the terpene profiles. Do you guys talk about terpenes a lot on your show?
We mention it in the those strains of, hey, this was the most prevalent terpene found in this strain, but we actually are recording later today our first episode on terpenes itself.
Oh, great.
So,
So we try to do that. We stagger it out. We'll go an indica, a sativa, and a hybrid strain throughout that, and then a 101. So going in depth into using a vaporizer, or what's in vape, and
what is THC, what is CBD, what is Delta 8, what does your endocannabinoid system do?
Exactly.
So we do little ones here and there to break in and kind of educate a little bit deeper on cannabis, what it is, how it affects you.
Right. So talk to me a little bit. I saw you had an Edibles 101 episode. Talk to me a little bit about, people have to go and really listen to this one, but give me a little teaser on that one.
Yeah, so basically, I'll go, because I've had some of the worst experiences. And my brother, who's an Iraq veteran, he gets incredibly anxious if you even mention edibles.
Wow.
And the reason why on edibles is, take your time doing it, because they want to be like as if they just took a hit off of a joint or smoked on a cart, whatever it is.
They want it right away.
They want it right away, and they wait an hour, or they wait 2 hours, or it's even 3 hours, and they're like, this is bogus. I'm just going to eat 2 more. And that was my brother later on,
Right. And then you get really scared when it kicks in.
Well, 3 hours into the future, he's in the bathtub crying with the shower on, because he's got the spin so bad. And now it drives anxiety up with him incredibly high. So we talked about, and from mine, it's just like, you need to take it easy. You need to understand the properties of edibles and what it's doing within your body. And Brandon went into depth on that. Just talking about what it turns into, and
11 hydroxy THC versus normally, Delta 9.
Stronger and lasts longer. Yep.
And lasts long. And that's the best thing. It's talking about the use, because too often people on the rec side just start eating them like they're Pez. Not everybody's going to be like Joey Diaz out there in Hollywood going, listen here, you got to eat 500, milligrams every day. That guy will just go nuts. He's popping stars of death, 2 of them. They're 500 milligrams a piece. And you're just
you have to have quite a tolerance. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a wonderful thing. But Brandon attested, edibles are a big part of his.
Tell me how you use edibles, Brandon.
Just like the guy popping Ducky Death Stars, at the same time, I have a crazy tolerance, and edibles don't, I can pop 800 milligrams and be fine. I don't do it for that. I usually dose 50 milligrams, and that will be, I could take one of those at the beginning of the day, one of those halfway through the day, and that'll just make it so that I'm not constantly in my back, because when the pain in the middle of my back is just to its worst, I can't focus on anything else. So taking that just helps it keep it at a level that I can focus, I can get work done, and I can function like a normal person. Now, terpenes, flower extracts on top of that just kind of make it nicer. But the edible level is just a nice manageable level that I know, hey, I take this, it'll keep me through that 4-6 hours, whatever, and I don't have to worry.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of our mantra at the podcast from Juana is to start low, go slow. And the Joey D has, who I'm not familiar with, but clearly this person has a tremendous, is that something you made up or is that a real person?
No, he's a stand-up comedian.
Oh, okay.
And I mean, on his podcast, he used to be consuming so much that this guy would pass out. I mean, there were stories of like people leaving halfway through the interview and getting bust. I mean, cops are just like, what are you doing? Like, people don't realize that edibles are, I would see them as a big purpose on certain people who are like, look, I can't smoke. Well, then get educated on what your endocannabinoid system is going to do with an edible.
Yep.
And talking to Wana brands, I mean, look at the quality, because quality of edibles goes a long way. We've all had really weird ones. We've had like, what's that
taste
flavor?
terrible. Yeah, I know.
Yeah, like I don't understand. And when you look at a Wana Brands product, and when you consume them, you know that there's quality in there based upon the texture, the taste, and when it starts kicking in, and there's a lot of process that goes into it. And quite often, I mean, yeah, you can get some really good home cooks that can make some great stuff, but on a commercial level, consistency of the experience that you're going to receive has got to be top notch. And from so many things that we have read about Wana, from people who have had horrible terminal cancer and being able to have less pain and being able to eat, a good friend of mine, his sister, she swore by Wana Brands, took her through the most painful parts of her chemotherapy. And it was so cool. And those are the kind of people, I mean, you wouldn't be like, yeah, just go smoke a joint in your bathroom. It's having the luxury of having these products today really helps out those with pain, anxiety, depression. We've seen tremendous effects with edibles.
Yeah.
And having another option aside from vaping, smoking,
right. That's the thing. Cannabis really is personal, and really so much more than other substances that I've had experience with, where really it affects different people in different ways. And it's just about, like, I'm glad you guys are doing what you're doing, because it's good to know, this is the history of this one, and this might affect you this way. And then you just have to try it and find out which is the best for you. Like somebody like you're saying, your brother might have an experience with edibles that scares them, and then other people might have an experience with edibles that's been completely saved their life. So it really depends on who it is and what their situation is.
Oh yeah, we just had somebody on our podcast, and she had a part of her large intestines removed, and she couldn't eat. She would throw up if she ate. And so she got into this routine of almost like intermittent fasting, but at the end of the day, she was able to use edibles or vape or something to be able to allow her to eat and not have pain.
Wow.
I mean, you're giving them a new life, and it's so easy, and it's delicious too. So
yeah. And you'll never know what you'll experience, because the more you get into it and dive into, okay, these terpenes, these cannabinoids or strains, whatever you want to look at, affect me this way, and knowing not everyone's experience is the same.
No.
Right.
But like you said, it's low and slow. That's what we preach every episode, is low and slow. That way you're not going to these experiences of, hey, I got super high and I never want to touch this again now because I had a bad experience. I understand. Like, I'm sure everyone who's used cannabis has had a bad experience.
Yeah.
And I would add that for those who are getting into edibles, the one thing that they'll overlook is they're just going like, I just need some indica or sativa edibles, but they really should be being able to couple or cross buy is CBD gummies to be able to go along with that one, just in case that ride gets a little too weird for you or too fast.
Kind of offsets it. CBD can offset it. Yeah.
Or a tincture, because if you hold it under your tongue, you bypass like digesting through your kidney, and it goes directly through your blood-brain barrier.
Yeah.
Although, what's interesting about tinctures, I had an experience pretty recently where I swallowed a lot of the tincture by accident, and so it didn't bypass because I swallowed it. So it's important with tinctures, I think, to make it sure that it really goes under your tongue, and then you keep it there until until your mucous membranes absorb it completely.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Because if you swallow it, it can have the same effect as almost like an edible. So basically what happened to me is, like, I was picking up my daughter at school, and all of a sudden I was like, boom, I was really, really high, and it surprised me. And she's just like, Daddy? And I'm like, we got to get home. Yeah. It's the longest walk home I've ever had.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. All right, listen, guys, this has been such a pleasure. The show is called the Cannabis School Podcast, and you can find it on any podcast, right, platform where podcasts are found. What's kind of next for it? Like, where do you guys see this all going?
Honestly, we tested it out, but this grew incredibly fast within less than a year, being the number one on Spotify, on Apple. When it comes to cannabis, you go to one of those, you write in cannabis, ours is the number one. We grew to pretty much being the number one cannabis podcast in the world as well, being able to attract people. We've got followers in China that are listening to us, and we created it for the reason that it's evergreen. It doesn't matter. We want to be able to talk to all sorts of brands because they're trying to produce some of the best products out there, but not all of them can claim that. And there's very few, like Wana, that has been around for a very long time, has a very good drive and vision of what they want to accomplish for their customers. And that's not easy to do. The cannabis companies come and go very quickly.
Yeah.
Like 80s movies, like randomness, like, what? You guys produce that? Like, yeah, it's awesome.
Well, I have that experience of even, when I go to these trade shows and I see all these companies, and then the next year they're gone.
Because it's crazy how fast they go.
It's hard to keep, unless you have a product that's got really good quality that people really feel loyal to. It's hard to catch on, especially now that there's a lot of consolidation in the industry.
We're planning on growing it bigger, and
Cannabis School strain. Well, you guys don't like strains. Yeah.
We have product ideas, but strain would be awesome to create. Yeah, we don't have specific genetics for that, but I think we've something to think about.
Yeah, we've played around with a couple of them. Our combos episode goes into that one.
That's
so
awesome.
If you listen to that one, it's pretty fun.
All right. Well, Jesse and Brandon, thank you for taking the time to talk to me today, and good luck with everything on your podcast. Maybe I can be number 2. Okay.
Yeah.
Done.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We're number 2. All right. Thanks, guys.
Awesome. Thanks,
Bye.
John.
Enhance Your Life is brought to you by Wana, the number 1 infused product in North America. Wana's entire process is designed to deliver the same great experience time after time. They have spent years fine-tuning their recipes so that their products are delicious, consistent, and potent. For more information, head on over to wanabrands.com. That's Wana, W-A-N-A, brands.com.